Today, I would like to introduce you to Clain Udy, who is the author of Rebranding Autism and the founder and CEO of Autism Elevated. Welcome, Clain.
It's a privilege to be here. Thank you for having me. We have a kindred cause in redefining autism and rebranding autism for the name of my book, the title of the book. But super excited to be with you.
Yeah, and it's such a honor to have you here. When I started to explore all the materials that I could get my hands on about what we currently know about autism and how are people talking about the whole spectrum, your book really stood out to me in a lot of ways. So to have you on here for one of my early episodes as I delve into this topic, it's a real privilege, and I look forward to learning from you today. And to start, can you share a little bit about your history and your journey with autism and how it led you to write the book?
Yeah, it begins in the year 2000. Many years ago, that not much was known about autism. My son was 4 years old in the year 2000. And there were some things that he was on the normal path. In fact, in the book, I call it the super normal path because I think as parents, we want, we recognize the need for our children to be loved and accepted from a safety standpoint, from a success standpoint. And so I saw my son as being kind of on that path to being a normal, happy, successful person. I think selfishly, I was looking for him to complete parts of my story that I hadn't completed at that point. So I kind of started to look at him and define a narrative for him, which was along a super normal path. But there were a few kind of flat notes in the music of his early life. For instance, he probably the biggest one was he wasn't speaking at the age of 4. So we lived in Texas at the time. We took him to speech therapy, had occupational therapy. But at one point, his speech therapist said, there's something here that a speech delay doesn't fully account for. It doesn't fully describe. And she mentioned autism. So that was the first introduction to autism. And then kind of the second induction into autism, and this was the tipping point. My wife had taken Christian to get his checkup, and he had a meltdown in the office of the physician's assistant. And he'd had these meltdowns before. So the fact that he had a meltdown didn't surprise me, but she immediately said, this child has autism. And when I heard this, I had come home from work. I was furious. How dare she, a 15-minute office visit, make that pronouncement on my really what she had done is found the thread that had started to unravel the narrative that I had in my mind about who my son was. And I calmed down and I started to do some internet research on autism, and there wasn't a lot, and almost all of it was very dismal. Autism is a lifelong condition that affects these domains, social communication, repetitive behaviors, and so there is no cure. I mean, this is a lifelong condition, and immediately I started to kind of thinking into the future to say, what is that going to look like? What is he going to look like when he becomes a teenager or an adult? Is he going to be able to drive a car or have a job or have a family? All those questions. I started to kind of look at this normal thing up here, and that was the first time that this thing called autism was really starting to conflict and introduce some huge questions about his future. So that's the first induction that I had into it. And I would say in the early years, it wasn't until he entered elementary school that the two narratives started to really clash, because you had this normal narrative that I subscribed to, that I was trying to push him toward, that his teachers at school were trying to push him toward. And then you had this autism narrative here that was full of deficit. And it was basically just creating tension between those two, and a false narrative about who he was at the time. I didn't realize that at the time, that that was what was happening, but later I came to realize that that was what was happening. And so I call this era the era of invisible electric fences, which he ran into daily because he wasn't able to decrypt what was happening around him socially. And also he knew what was expected, in terms of this, and he was failing. I mean, there was no way that he could be that. His brain was just wired differently. He saw it and experienced the world differently. And this is something that I didn't see at the time. I thought the autism is just this thing that is being somehow inflicted on my son, and our job is to try to mitigate that as much as possible and try to find fixes, cures, try to coach, try to moderate. And that was a very, very stressful proposition, to try to coax someone into a narrative that was just not going to happen, was never going to happen. We did it with all the love that a parent could possibly give, but we were very much focused on seeing our son seeing autism through a deficit lens, that we didn't realize at the time was broken, a broken lens. So that's kind of the early years and the very turbulent. I know that, I've spoken to many, many parents and almost the exact same narrative. So up until the point where he was 12, by the time he was moving on from elementary school into junior high, he had begun to kind of write his own narrative. And that is, if I engage, if I interact with people, bad things are going to happen. And so it's better not to interact with people. So he started to shut down. He started to withdraw and didn't trust the world, didn't trust himself in the world, communicating with people. So that's where we uh we were up until the age of 12.
And what you're describing is many people's early experiences. It's a provider who sometimes with an evaluation or sometimes almost nonchalantly says this thing without any context. They will say the word autism and it's up to the parents to fill in the blanks. So to me, that points to a missed opportunity for providers, first and foremost, to be able to provide a different perspective early on. You did not have that. You mentioned that once you started to shut down, withdraw, was that when something shifted, that you started looking for a different perspective?
Absolutely. That was the exact time. And it all happened within, certainly within a year, if not 6 months. And two things, significant things happened. The first was, we first of all, I went with him everywhere. Either my wife, if it was a few get-togethers or birthday parties that he was invited to, we were just continually up to that point trying to engineer little friendships, and it just wasn't working. But nonetheless, we kept trying, and we were always there with him, and I was there with him. Any scouting event, any sort of outing where he would be interacting with other people, A, to protect him, and B, to try to, again, coach him as much as possible in real time to be normal. So so to mitigate some of the behaviors, some of this autism narrative. And so one summer, he had a multi-day scout trip up in the mountains, and it was the kind I'd never missed any of his outings. I always went under the guise of being a volunteer, but because of my work, I was traveling. I couldn't make it for the first night, and so I was really nervous because almost inevitably every summer, and this still happens, some young autistic kid goes missing, and that's just a terrifying proposition. And so these are the high mountains in the Uintas. And, the thought of Christian going missing in the mountains, was just terrifying to me, but I couldn't get away from it. So I drove up to the camp, and they'd already had spent the night one night, but this would have been the second night. It was dark. Located our troops, campsite, and I saw some warm and glowing tents with, boys laughing and telling stories, and and I was hopeful that he was part of that, that he was in that world with them. And so I poked my head in the first tent, and he wasn't there. So it was wall to wall boys. And so I went to the second tent, and I said, "Is Christian here?" And no, he's not here. I think he's over in that tent. And so I looked over there, and kind of off to the side in the periphery was our family's tent, which was ridiculously big for a family of four. I think it would hold like 10 people, but it was dark, completely dark. And so I made my way over there, hoping that at least somebody you know, was there with him, and poked my head in the tent, and there he was alone in the middle of the tent, all by himself. And I'll never forget the look on his face. He said, "Hey, Dad," and he was really, really excited to see me. And that was not typical because, I didn't see that kind of relief and expression a lot. And so um, I said, "Hey, did you spend the night by yourself last night?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "It was cold." I said, "Was it cold?" And he said, "Yeah, it was cold." And so it was like I was upset. How could this have happened? How could have the leaders not have recognized, hey, we've got a problem here? Or the boys, would realize that, this is something bigger than me. Anyway, I wanted to go talk to people, but mostly I just wanted to be with my son. And so, I was laying in my sleeping bag next to him, and it was like a a breath of, a new breeze kind of started to sweep over me as I realized that, you know what, I can't rely on other people. I can't rely on other people to safeguard and integrate and, be friends with. I can't rely on other people to do that. I can rely on us, our family. We can control that. We can control what happens in our world. And so here in I resolved right then, I'm gonna stop chasing normal. Full stop. I'm done. Whatever they can have their normal world, people, and I'm gonna create ours, that works for him. And there was just such a refreshing sense of rejection of that normal concept and defiance. It was like super liberating because this is the first time where I felt 100% empowered to shift the narrative away from, again, this normal, and whatever that new narrative looked like, I was ready for it. And it's interesting because, side by side, you had these two paradigms, these two worlds. One is normal with the warm and glowing tents and ghost stories, right? Ghost stories and all that stuff, normal communication. And then you had our world. And I say our world because the reason it was dark and the reason it stood apart on its own and in that kind of dark state was because I hadn't realized that I could change that world. After that, I realized that I could. And so the second complementary thing happened soon after that. I was rereading two books. One was called First Break All the Rules, which is a title that just, connected with me at that point. And then the second one was Now Discover Your Strengths by Marcus Buckingham and Don Clifton. And so I was reading that, and it was one of those things where it was a whole body read, where you read a few paragraphs and then you just stand up and walk around and process, and because it's just mind blowing, the implications that I guess I should explain the book. The book is basically the result of a long Gallup study. They interviewed over 130,000 managers to answer the question, what makes a good manager? And the one conclusion that they reached throughout this whole wasn't strategy, wasn't vision. It was good managers are able to see strength. They're able to recognize strength in their people, and they put their teams in a position where they can exercise and grow and develop that strength. So that's the premise. That's the key takeaway of the book. And I thought this applies to no one as much as it applies to my son. So from that moment on, we started to focus very explicitly, very deliberately on finding and growing and focusing on overwhelmingly on his strengths. So that was really the turning point.
And when I was reading your book, this was one of the parts that really stood out to me when you said the rebranding starts at home, and from there you can impact the world around you. And you mentioned the example with the providers. If they had a different understanding of autism, things could be a little bit different there. The second part are the chaperones of these activities with young kids. If they knew better, if they were educated on a different narrative of autism, perhaps they can inspire those kids to behave a little bit differently. And you mentioned schools as well. There was this clash of narratives where it's almost the normal versus the autistic narrative. But what you're describing in rebranding it is that you decrease that gap and there becomes a different possibility for kids like Christian to be understood. What was your experience once you started to change this at home and your ability to impact the world around him?
Well, overall, I'll go through kind of a few examples of this, but overall, we started to find the real narrative because we couldn't find that authentic narrative about who Christian was with these two conflicting false narratives. So we started to align and find an authentic narrative that was truly him. And so it was not it was not easy at first because we were so used to focusing on the deficits. He was used to focusing on the deficits, and plus, at 12, it's kind of hard to bring into view strengths in a very nuanced way. But we started to look for cues and clues. So we knew that he was we suspected he was very good visually, spatially. He would sit for hours and do Legos and different models, and he was very precise, would read the instructions, build the thing. So we knew that he was drawn toward working with physical things and that he probably had a pretty high visual spatial IQ. And so that was confirmed when he was in second grade. He had drawn the classroom assignment was to draw a landscape. And so he had drawn a road that reached a vanishing point, and he had the telephone, lines, and it was almost mathematical, how they began to get smaller and closer together until till they reached a vanishing point. And sorry, this still chokes me up a little bit, but so anyway, it was in his parent teacher conference. His teacher said, "No second grader does this." At the time, we were proud of that. We noted that, but we didn't tie it to anything bigger than that. We didn't tie it to this bigger narrative. Now we started to reference that. Remember when he actually had an IQ test as part of his IEP, and he scored like in the 99th percentile for visual spatial ability. So that confirmed, his visual spatial abilities. And then I think the other clue was cars. For the time he was very young, he would ask anytime we'd get in the car, it was questions about cars. "Hey, dad, which one would accelerate faster? Hey, dad, which one has better braking?" Or, and over and over and over again just to process this. So, and a lot of it was about the cars, but a lot of it was about physics. So he was starting to see the world and trying to explain the physics of the world, through cars. And so I wasn't a car guy before that, but I became a car guy. And so we started to watch Top Gear, which is a British motoring show. We watched every episode, and 14th, 15th Christmas, we bought him a 65 Ford Mustang. It was an old rusty Mustang, and we said, we're going to restore this, me and you, over the next 3 years, and which we did. We rebuilt the engine. We built the engine up to give it more horsepower, restored the interior, the exterior, everything. And then at one point, we went to his school, and he had a fundraiser, and they had art featured on the walls of the school, and we found his, and it was this really impressive concept car. And I think he was only like 13 at the time. And I was blown away. And I said, so I started to introduce the possibility of employment. And I said, "Hey, bud, some people design cars for a living." And I could tell that he connected with that. Um, we downloaded Google SketchUp. He started to model cars, car parts, engines, camshafts, pistons, and it was as much about the machinery of the car as it was the design of the car. So that's that's when he started to tell himself a strength story about himself. And and I will say that we wouldn't have been able to facilitate that because as parents, we are the people who help our children tell their story daily. And if we're telling ourselves the wrong story, if we're not honoring and discovering their story, there's no way we can we can make that happen. There's no way to facilitate that. That's when everything started to change. He started to develop an identity based on his strengths and, rather trying to fit in, trying to conform. And I think that it starts, as you say, with the home. It's, rebranding starts in the home, in helping people redefine who they are, young autistic kids, help them redefine who they are. And then you, as parents, can start to educate others and explain that narrative. They also will be able to step into that and start to explain who they are to other people as well.
All of my reading about what an autistic child needs or what an autistic adult needs, there's I have all these notes in my margins that are like, this is for everyone. And one of the thoughts that keeps going through my mind is how autistic people are almost canaries in the coal mine showing us what's not working, and in a way that you can't ignore it. And you couldn't ignore that he was sitting there by himself. Maybe another kid just gets ostracized and the parent doesn't feel that same understanding of what this means, and the kid kind of just manages, gets by. But what you pointed out about how you had to decide to look at him through a strength perspective, and that you and your wife seeing him that way allowed him to see himself that way. When we look at kids these days, how many parents pick the extracurriculars at school? They choose the clubs they'll be in, they choose the sports that they're going to play so that they can help the kid achieve this goal for this college or get accepted here. And perhaps those kids also are internalizing a deficit, and this is not even autism, this is just the average kid. And so everything that you're saying helped Christian, I think could actually be applied to parenting in general. And I know you have the First Ascent program. Can you share how you're able to teach parents this paradigm shift?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So I guess just to back up a little bit, we had seen, a very unmistakable change in Christian once we started to look through and discover him for all that he is versus all that he isn't. So still, I didn't know whether he could have a career. I didn't know whether be able to work. I didn't know what that looked like at that point. So I started to look. He was probably like 13, 14 at the time. So I'm looking out, you know, for when he's, late teens, early 20s, try to understand what that is going to be for him, what that's going to look like. And I started to do a lot of research on employment among autistic people, and terrible, awful. At the time, there was this major study that said that upwards of 85% of high functioning autistic people were either unemployed or underemployed. It was the highest unemployment rate of any class of people. And I knew the skills, I knew the strengths. I had been focused on strengths. So I started to do research and figure out, why is this? Why is this happening? And how can I hack this system to produce better outcomes? And it does start with developing a strength narrative, understanding your strengths, being in a career that overwhelmingly plays to your strengths, because there's plenty of non-strengths that need to be mitigated, you know, overshadowed by strengths. So that was the central premise. If I can help people um, align in a much more nuanced way, like you say, most people, you know, the canary in the coal mine. A lot of people don't know. I would say most young, you know, teens are not don't have a clear pathway forward from a career perspective. And our methods of helping them are very crude, but nonetheless, they're able to somehow navigate that. They're able to make the adaptations, they're able to have the support network, they're able to, you know, pivot. Folks on the autism spectrum are much more specialized. I see it like a garden. You know, you have all these plants. Some of those plants can grow in a larger variety of conditions, spaces, water, sunlight. The way I see autism is it's usually much more specialized. It's a place in the garden where they're going to thrive. And if they're not in that place, they're not going to thrive at all. In fact, they'll do the opposite. So that was the basic premise I put together. This was maybe 13, 14 years ago. I put together the initial First Ascent program, and it was started with defining strengths, understanding strengths. I put together an assessment to understand strengths, and then we started to cast our net wide. Let's look at all these careers. Let's see how they line up with strengths, and then we start to narrow that down until we have our summit career, and then let's start putting together a very progressive work learning a pathway to that career. And all the time I'm doing this real time with Christian. We knew that he was capable of college. We suspected. It was a bit of an unknown there, but we suspected he could go to college. So we right after graduation, by the way, he graduated with a certificate, 1,200-hour certificate in computer aided design when he graduated at the same time he graduated from high school. So two concurrent, one certification program, one college, or excuse me, high school diploma. But right after that, we we enrolled in one class at the typical state college, about 30 minutes from where we lived. My wife rehearsed the first day with him. Got on the bus, you know, this is the bus we're taking, went to the campus, located all of the places, the books, located where his class was going to be, located where his professor's office was, and just did a dress rehearsal for one class. And so he did great in that class with you know a lot of support from us, but he proved that he could take a college class. So the next semester we took two classes. And the next semester we took three, you know. So we just very progressively rather than these it's kind of like, you know, the difference between assisted climbing and free climbing, free soloing, right? Most of our steps, neurotypical steps would be like graduate from high school, enter college, full load, you know, in your degree, graduate from college, get a job. You know, those are the big, like scary steps. For autistic young people, it needs to be much more calculated, much more progressive. Then after a couple of years, we wanted to test, can he work? Can he have a full-time job? So we knew that he would do well in manufacturing. So the very first we hacked the system. We found a side door into that through a temp agency. He spent his first work experience was putting pills in bottles at a nutritional supplement plant, and he worked the night shift. So he would get in his car, same thing. We rehearsed. We drove the car to where the plant was, and we rehearsed that. And I was in Mexico at the time, and he was, staying on her home alone, and I was terrified that this was the night. He would go to work at 7, or at night, and then he would drive home at 7 a.m., work through the night. And so I was like super nervous. Would he quit? Would he blow up? And so I kept trying to call him, but he wasn't answering from I was in Mexico. And finally got a hold of him. I said, "Hey, bud, how did things go?" He goes, "I think they went okay." So he had that job for 3 months, did great. Then we found another opportunity through the temp agency making airbags for cars. And again, this played right into his strengths of very conventional, very structured. You're trained how to do it, and then you just execute. Boom, boom, with precision. That's where he shines. So one of the places he shines. So after 6 months, he was hired full time and was one of their top performers. He would notice things that other people wouldn't notice, and just extremely reliable, almost like mechanical. You show him something once, and he's got it. It's like hitting play. And then he went back to school. So long story short, he has 1 semester left here at the university, and he'll have his college degree in mechanical engineering.
Wow. Do you think that would have been possible if you stayed in the kind of trying to fit into normal paradigm?
Not not at all likely. I can say with high level of confidence because I've worked with so many parents who have been on this neurotypical track, and I've seen overwhelmingly failure when they don't discover strength, when they don't see strength, when they don't align the future, the pathway of their children towards strength, and don't take a very calculated and progressive approach toward that. So that's what First Ascent does. There are 3 different stages. The first one is align. We're going to find the near ideal career for you based on your strengths, and we go to great extent to understand those strengths. Then it's also environment. If you have strengths but you're in the wrong environment, then that can undo everything. So we focus on identifying strengths, then we start to understand what kind of environment you need to be in order to thrive. And then prepare is we go through these micro testing cycles where we we say, okay, so what's the next step you're gonna take? And what do you want to learn from that? What are your assumptions about what that's gonna be, what it's gonna look like? Are you gonna like it? Are you gonna be able to do well in this environment? And then we test that with real world opportunities. So they see it as not so much if I'm not successful here, it's a fail. They see that as I'm learning. I'm learning what works for me in a very scientific. I mean, you make your hypothesis, you run your test, you look at the outcome, and then you revise that process. So I think it's a beautiful thing because finding that right space and that right condition and that right environment in the right career along the right career path is much more specialized. And along the way, you get to learn about yourself. You get to understand who you are. You get to really start to refine your own narrative. In fact, I started out with what I called a personal user guide in the day when people used user guides. You know, this is who I am. This is how I operate. This is some of the areas that I need to be aware of. Whereas, and these are some of the strategies to help me navigate those areas. So it's all about self discovery along a practical path toward a viable career.
And it's a practical path towards a viable career, but also for life. I remember reading about this personal user guide. You gave the example of the couple who created these personal user guides so that the other one knows, like, okay, if I'm exhibiting these behaviors, it means I'm already too far, and so here are the things that I definitely need, and here's the things I definitely do not need. And I thought to myself, man, what if we all had that for ourselves? Like, and the reason, again, I bring this up is to highlight how the way that you chose to support Christian. What if the way that quote unquote normal process for school, where you leave high school, you're still a child, you go and take a full course load, and you end up graduating 4 years later, you go into career. What if there was an option to take it slower for everyone, where instead of being told this is how it should be, you actually support people in discovering what they like, what they don't like during these years that are actually very important for the development of your sense of self and just how you view your strengths and who you are in the world.
I think it's 100% applicable to anyone, this pathway. And we have a lot of people who are very unhappy with their work. Yeah, they've been successful in going through those steps and getting a job, but they still are stumbling around trying to figure out who they are and what their strengths are and what works for them. So again, canary in the coal mine. You've got these autistic people who absolutely must go through this well calibrated process. And then you got everyone else who has managed it, but there's a cost to that too.
The They manage. They don't thrive, they don't discover themselves, and they oftentimes end up in our ketamine clinic trying to understand, how did I get here? And it's so often that you hear, my parents wanted me to do this when I was younger, and I just followed this because that's just what we did in our family. And it could be so beneficial to build this new paradigm where, yes, it's going to be more inclusive for autistic kids throughout schooling and then autistic adults, but it's a paradigm that makes everyone's lives a little bit better.
Mhm.
And the the reality with the new paradigm is you cannot use the metrics of the old system to know if this new paradigm is going to work.
Yeah, you have to first rethink it at a family level in the home. That's where it starts. And then you can start to educate and influence. Schools are basically they're based on conformity. They're little factories of education. And so yeah, there might be a nod here and there to, the individual strengths and the uniquenesses of students, depending on the teacher. Some teachers are just that way and they get it, but a lot of them don't, and the system doesn't. Isn't built for that. So, to the degree that you have parents, and when they're older, young adults in school or teenager starting to educate and starting to influence the school system. And I think that in our case, we needed that kind of partnership with our school. So that's another thing that we did differently when Christian was 12, and we started to see things differently and redefine his world, his narrative, was to he attended charter schools. And so what I found with the charter schools that I was involved with, there's a much higher ability to partner with teachers and to partner with the schools because they have to attract students and they have to retain students. So they're motivated to talk with you as a parent in a way that maybe district schools wouldn't be. And this is not a slam on any school type, but we found that it was a much more amenable partner in that process when we were working with charter schools than district schools.
And this was in your book, you gave a lot of examples and at different stages of schooling, what parents can do to advocate for their kids. And I think that's a really amazing resource for just starting the conversation. And like you said, it starts at home, but then kids spend so much time at school. So how do you start shifting that and then onward to employers?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a critical mass thing if we can get enough parents out there rebranding, redefining autism and finding authentic narratives based on strength in their homes with their young people, then that's going to emanate upward and outward into impacting the way the community sees, the way schools see, the way workplaces see differences and neurodiverse differences.
There's one quote that I really like from a book called The Conscious Parent, and it said that the parent child relationship is primarily about the evolution of the parent and
Percent.
only secondarily about raising the child. What would you say the biggest transformation that you noticed in yourself having Christian as a son?
The biggest transformation goes back to the tent experience and just feeling free to reject this normal paradigm and giving myself permission to redefine life on our own terms, in our own way. It's been incredibly liberating. You look at all of the byproducts or benefits of doing that, the stress almost immediately starts to go away because now you are focused on everything that's good, everything that's right. In the book, I have a quote: "In life, you find what you're looking for. If you look for weakness, you'll find it and you'll grow it. If you look for strength, you'll find it and you'll grow it." And so look for strength. So the ability to be on that journey, that strength journey is the most freeing thing. You're still going to see the differences, but you're going to see them very, very differently. They're not as worrisome to you. You don't, care. That's how that's how his brain is wired, and I'm 100% behind that. But all of your focus is on strength. So it's improves changes the dynamic, the relationship fundamentally between parents and young people and their children. And it gives you permission to celebrate what before you were embarrassed of. And so it changes everything, but I would say in a word, freedom.
That's that's incredible to hear you say that because how many parents at the start of their journey would consider a diagnosis of autism leading to freedom.
What I will say is that all so the First Ascent program, we have the parents or a parent goes through the program with their young adult. And it is about as much about the transformation of the parent as it is with of the young people. Parents at the end started to see, I for the first time, I'm seeing my son, I'm seeing my daughter. And that's like extremely, extremely gratifying. So these are young adults, and this is the first time their parents are starting to see them for who they are. And that weight is sort of starting to be taken off of their shoulders, and they're starting to be able to redefine, their son or their daughter in a way that celebrates who they are. I would say most parents um, are not there when you know when they go start our program, and there's varying degrees of success, but everyone goes through some sort of a transformation, a recognition of the need to see and redefine their world.
You give them an enormous gift with your work.
Well, I hope so. I think so, and it's very gratifying.
In our last few minutes, I want to ask you a question. What do you wish people would unlearn about their current understanding of autism?
I want them to let go of that false narrative. I want them to see that for what it is and unlearn the idea that in order for someone to have a successful, happy, a fulfilling life, that is somehow tied to this false narrative, because it isn't. It's the exact opposite. And so I want them to start to see, along with that rejection, that defiance. And that's the other thing that I love to see is when parents start to defy that idea. And along with that, you stop seeing everything that is broken in the deficit lens that is broken. And you cast that aside and you start to look through a strength-based lens, a new lens that redefines everything. So I would hope that for again, for parents, and then subsequent to that, other members of society.
I think that like you said, family, community, culture, it's going to follow that trend, and it's going to take parents advocating and teaching their kids how to advocate for themselves. And I think the world will be better for it.
I think if we can all just do our part to make a dent in the world, I think that, again, it's a matter of critical mass. And so I think that, rather than look to some other huge government body or somebody up here to do that for us, which we can't control, if we can start that in a home, then it's very freeing, it's very empowering, and that's where we can make the biggest impact overall.
Clain, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing this story and how you evolved your understanding of the importance of this strength based lens. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so autismelevated.com, is our website. You can find the book. I would say the book is called Rebranding Autism, A Guide to Seeing Strength on the Spectrum. I think that's a good starting point for anyone. It's on Amazon, it's on Barnes and Noble. If you go to the website, you'll see information on it. And then if you're interested in the First Ascent program, there's information on the website about the First Ascent program. And we're going to be rolling out additional programs for other age groups based on the same foundation, the same framework. So yeah, visit us at autismelevated.com. And if you want to reach out to me, feel free to do that. Would love to talk.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Julia.